Good morning and welcome to the ninth edition of the World's Wide Project. Many issues to talk about today. One of the most important issues is the death of a United States citizen just recently. Apparently, according to his family, he was in good condition when he went to North Korea, and he was arrested for stealing a poster in order for him, to remember when he was in North Korea. He never thought that this attitude, just to take a poster, as a souvenir, it was going to cause him to be arrested and kept in jail for quite a while. Just a few days ago, the young man who was returned to the United States, and he was in a coma, and he just died a few days ago. For many, this is the top of the iceberg regarding North Korea and the United States relationships. President Trump has said on a tweet that we will handle the situation. And nobody knows what that means, but it's certainly according to the vice president in his last interview when North Korea launched the ninth missile to the Japan Sea. Well, he suggested to North Korean president, not to push the buttons of the United States because it will be a bad idea for him to do such a thing. Yes, North Korea has paraded his immense and mighty arsenal when it comes to missiles, when it comes to tanks, infantry, etc. And he has good relationships with China as an ally. But the death of this kid, of this young man, has sparked a lot of opinions against North Korea, which already had the world against him in human rights issues and how he controls his population, the population of the North Korea country. Just recently, when North Korea was exercising the ninth missile and launching the ninth missile, South Korea was training with the United States exercises, naval and infantry exercises, pretty close to Japan also, of course. But nobody knew that this young man will die after being sent by the North Korean government to the United States in order to wash their hands and say, "No, you have nothing to do with that." The family is saying, "Yes, you do. You torture our kid, and we want you to respond about these accusations." Certainly, situation is very tense when it comes to North Korea and the United States. The United States is planning on, is speaking right now with China in order for China to start fastening the relationships with North Korea. If China wants to keep in good relationships with the United States is asking from China to apply some sanctions against this North Korean country. Everybody's wondering, why is it that the United States have not attacked or destroyed the missiles that have been launched into the Japan Sea lately? What is taking so long for them to do such an act in response of the North Korean president, which certainly has shown that shows no respect for the American people or the American administration since Obama. Certainly, the beginning of a war is the last thing that the world wants or American wants. But tensions are growing not only in North Korea. Yes, the right thing to do will be to show the power of the United States. Now there are the satellites and the war that was implemented since the 80s by President Ronald Reagan. It will be time for the world to know what is the capability of these war satellites that were developed since the 80s. What is taking so long? Nobody knows. A direct attack against North Korea, it's a possibility that is being contemplated nowadays by the American government. The other issue is that a couple days ago, a Syrian airplane was destroyed by an American airplane. And that didn't please Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation. He's very anxious about it, and he just said immediately that if this attitude continues by NATO, he's going to react against NATO or the United States or whatever army that crosses the airspace of Syria. We already know that Syria is in the interest of the Russian Federation. They are allies. They have been allies for more than 40 years, more than 50 years. And they want to protect each other. Just like NATO says that if one of the countries that are members of NATO, if it's attacked, well, NATO will respond against such country. The same is happening with Russia, Syria, and Iran. And as we know, Saudi Arabia just got recently an agreement with the United States, with President Trump, regarding $360 billion investments. $110 billion are going to go to develop armament, weaponry, airplanes, tanks, you name it, whatever, missiles, long and medium range missiles to Saudi Arabia. And everybody's asking, how come the United States is going to invest $110 billion in weaponry for Saudi Arabia, who has broken all kinds of human rights when it comes to its own country and Yemen, especially Yemen, causing one of the worst situations when it comes to starvation, displacement, and destruction of a country. Yemen is one of those. How come the United States is interested in developing $110 billion more when it comes to weaponry for Saudi Arabia? Now that Qatar has been accused of promoting terrorist groups, it doesn't make sense, don't you think? Especially when we already know that 15 out of 19 people involved in the 9/11 attacks in 2001 were Saudi Arabians citizens. That's another issue. President Donald Trump said, running for president in his campaign in 2016, that he will show the world and the American people what really happened in 9/11, who were involved in that situation, in those attacks and those terrorist attacks that caused the nations of the world to crumble against terrorism. Of course, there are many issues that we have to speak about those attacks. There are scientists, engineers, physicists that contradict by testing the so-called 9/11 Commission, and which they say that it's impossible that the towers just came down like a domino effect, which, okay, everybody knows that that's a total lie. Donald Trump said it in his own words. That's a total lie. We're going to find out who's behind these attacks, and we're going to get into the end, from the beginning to the end of this investigation.
Behind these doors in the U.S. Capitol is a vault that contains one of the most secret and sensitive documents in the United States. 28 pages that could shed light on the events of 9/11. They've been seen by very few people, and you'll hear from some of them.
I think it is implausible to believe that 19 people, most of whom didn't speak English, could have carried out such a complicated task without some support from within the United States.
And you believe that the 28 pages are crucial to this?
I think they are a key part.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 men armed with box cutters, directed by a man on dialysis in a cave fortress halfway around the world using a satellite phone and a laptop, directed the most sophisticated penetration of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, overpowering the passengers and the military combat-trained pilots on 4 commercial aircraft before flying those planes wildly off course for over an hour without being molested by a single fighter interceptor. These 19 hijackers, devout religious fundamentalists who like to drink alcohol, snort cocaine, and live with pink-haired strippers, managed to knock down 3 buildings with 2 planes in New York, while in Washington a pilot who couldn't handle a single-engine Cessna was able to fly a 757 in an 8,000-foot descending 270-degree corkscrew turn to come exactly level with the ground, hitting the Pentagon and the Budget Analyst Office, where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced missing from the Pentagon's coffers in a press conference the day before, on September 10th, 2001. Luckily, the news anchors knew who did it within minutes.
Osama bin Laden.
The pundits knew within hours.
Osama bin Laden.
The administration knew within the day.
Terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
And the evidence literally fell into the FBI's lap.
That a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
But for some reason, a bunch of crazy conspiracy theorists demanded an investigation into the greatest attack on American soil in history. That investigation was delayed, underfunded, set up to fail, a conflict of interest, and a cover-up from start to finish. It was based on testimony extracted through torture, the records of which were destroyed. It failed to mention the existence of WTC-7, Able Danger, P-TECH, Sibel Edmonds, OBL and the CIA, and the drills of hijacked aircraft being flown into buildings that were being simulated at the precise same time that those events were actually happening. It was lied to by the Pentagon, the CIA, the Bush administration, and as for Bush and Cheney, well, no one knows what they told it because they testified in secret, off the record, not under oath, and behind closed doors. It didn't bother to look at who funded the attacks because that question is ultimately of little practical significance. Still, the 9/11 Commission did brilliantly answering all of the questions the public had, except most of the victims' family members' questions, and pinned blame on all the people responsible, although no one so much as lost their job, determining the attacks were
failure of imagination.
Because
nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government could envision flying airplanes into buildings.
Except the Pentagon, FEMA, NORAD, and the NRO. The DIA destroyed 2.5 terabytes of data on Able Danger, but that's okay because it probably wasn't important. The SEC destroyed their records on the investigation into the insider trading before the attacks, but that's okay because destroying the records of the largest investigation in SEC history is just part of routine record keeping. NIST has classified the data that they used for their model of WTC-7's collapse, but that's okay because knowing how they made their model of the collapse would jeopardize public safety. The FBI has argued that all material related to their investigation of 9/11 should be kept secret from the public, but that's okay because the FBI probably has nothing to hide. This man never existed, nor is anything he had to say worthy of your attention, and if you say otherwise, you are a paranoid conspiracy theorist and deserve to be shunned by all of humanity. Likewise him, and her. And her, and her, and him. Osama bin Laden lived in a cave fortress in the hills of Afghanistan, but somehow got away. Then he was hiding out in Tora Bora, but somehow got away. Then he lived in Abbottabad for years, taunting the most comprehensive intelligence dragnet employing the most sophisticated technology in the history of the world for a decade, releasing video after video with complete impunity and getting younger and younger as he did so, before finally being found in a daring SEAL team raid which wasn't recorded on video, in which he didn't resist or use his wife as a human shield, and in which these crack special forces operatives panicked and killed this unarmed man, supposedly the best source of intelligence about those dastardly terrorists on the entire planet. Then they dumped his body in the ocean before telling anyone about it. Then a couple dozen of that team's members died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. This is the story of 9/11, brought to you by the media which told you the hard truths about
his hip could be seen to move violently forward.
And
they took the babies out of incubators.
And
mobile production facilities.
And
the rescue of Jessica Lynch.
If you have any questions about this story, you are a batshit paranoid tinfoil dog-abusing baby hater and will be reviled by everyone. If you love your country and or freedom, happiness, rainbows, rock and roll, puppy dogs, apple pie, and your grandma, you will never ever express doubts about any part of this story to anyone. Ever. This has been a public service announcement by the Friends of the FBI, CIA, NSA, DIA, SEC, NSM, White House, NIST, and the 9/11 Commission. Because ignorance is strength.
What happened with the $360 billion that the United States are gonna, that Saudi Arabia is going to invest with the United States interests, including $50 billion for oil and gas development, of course, which is going to benefit plenty of people, hopefully, in the United States and Saudi Arabia, of course. But the other issue that these $360 billion are questioning the public opinion is what is going to happen then with the investigation of 9/11. What is going to happen then with the suit that has been presented in courts in the United States and Saudi Arabia regarding the attacks of 9/11? Why? There's 800 families that have gathered together and they said, okay, they actually sued the Saudi Arabian government, not only for moral and the participation of the events that took place in 9/11 and the disastrous death of more than 3,000 people, but for moral and accountability regarding the 9/11 attacks. So what is President Trump going to do? Is he going to put this investigation of 9/11 in the back pocket? Is he? Is he going to disregard the 800 families that are accusing and suing the Saudi Arabian government? Is he going to just forget it because he's a businessman? And, what businessman said, it's nothing personal, it's just business. What's going to happen? the public opinion is waiting for Mr. Trump's answers. But apparently the only way he answers to the people is tweeting, not more than a paragraph. So nobody knows what's going to happen with President Trump's answers now that $360 billion are playing an important part in these investigations that he promised to solve or resolve in his campaign for the presidency of the United States, the most powerful country in the world. That is something that we have to find out pretty soon. The public opinion, the world's public opinion. Other issues have happened recently that we want to mention in the World's Wealth Project. What's going to happen with TTIP? Yes, President Trump has withdrawn from the TPP, but that's not the only issue here. There's other, like TISA and TTIP, that are still going on. And we all know that WikiLeaks have been offering 100,000 euros for someone who can tell what is going on with the TTIP and these trade agreements that nobody knows what is going on, especially when the senators, representatives from Europe, in Europe, cannot see what is in the details of the agreements, when they have only 2 hours to check on the documents. They cannot take photographs, they cannot take nothing with them, so they cannot discuss or make the arrangements necessary in order to benefit for those free trade agreements. WikiLeaks was very specific in this matter, and Julian Assange make proper comments about it. You can find them in many instances in different places on YouTube that are very worrisome regarding these treaties.
WikiLeaks is raising a €100,000 reward for Europe's most wanted secret, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership.
This is something enormous. It is about a final control, and it's the United States saying there may be another power in the world, but we will be the ultimate power.
The TTIP is the most important thing that is happening in Europe right now. It's a secretive deal being negotiated between Europe and the United States.
Once signed, it will cement a key part of the US government's plan to create a new global bloc that will ensure the dominance of its largest companies. And to understand why, we need to go back to the 1950s.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America's asking you to call. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA.
After the Second World War, the United States accounted for half of the world's economy. Its influence was unmatched by any country, and it was able to write the early rules of international trade to its advantage. The World Trade Organization was created in this context, and the US dictated rules that favored American business. But as economies like China and India joined the WTO, it became a more democratized arena, and the US found it harder to control its decision-making.
At the WTO, at its Doha rounds, India spoke up and Brazil spoke up, and the US lost control.
I think it's no use beating around the bush. This meeting has collapsed.
The US felt it needed a new strategy to maintain its global dominance. So in the classical American style, they went big. To bypass the WTO, they're creating the biggest international agreements that the world has ever seen. They're called the 3 Big T's. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, and the Trade in Services Agreement, or TISA. And they're all being negotiated in secret right now.
We only found out when WikiLeaks was able to leak parts of them.
And what's interesting is when you look across all of these deals, whether it be TTIP, TPP or TISA, China is excluded, but also Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, they're all excluded because those are the emerging economies.
What is not often understood is that these agreements are part of a geopolitical war. This is a new war which is taking place between the United States and China The United States is very scared of the rise of China, so it has moved to militarily encircle it through what is called the pivot to Asia, and now it's moving on to doing that economically.
The basic idea which comes across from reading US strategy papers is the construction of a new grand enclosure. And to put inside this grand enclosure, the United States, 51 other countries, 1.6 billion people, and 2/3 of global GDP. To integrate Latin America away from Brazil and towards the United States, to integrate Southeast Asia away from China and towards the United States, and to integrate Western Europe, pulling it away from Eurasia as a whole and towards the Atlantic.
Of the three big T's, WikiLeaks has revealed 4 chapters of the TPP, which affects 12 countries in the Americas and Southeast Asia. We also obtained and released the core text of TISA, which affects 52 countries, including the EU. But nearly all of TTIP is still secret. When signed, TTIP will cover half of global GDP and will affect every European member state. Yet EU parliamentarians have serious restrictions in accessing the proposed agreement.
Yeah, I find it incredible as well that for something which is a trade agreement, not a matter of life and death in terms of security, where maybe you can understand some restrictions, and we don't even like those very much, but for a trade agreement, you know, that we can't actually make notes about what it is we're reading, issues that we might want to take away to look into, which actually might reassure us, you know, if we really were able to sort of take this away and look at it in depth.
We don't have access to the key documents, the most important ones, because the devil is in the detail. When it comes to trade agreements, you need to know exactly what's in the text so that you can assess what the impact's going to be.
If EU parliamentarians want to see the TTIP, they have to call the US Embassy and make an appointment. The appointments are only available 2 days a week for 2-hour time slots. Only 2 parliamentarians are permitted at once. They go to the US Embassy, they have to hand in every electronic device, so they cannot possibly make a copy. They must agree to keep everything confidential, and then they're led to a secure reading room where 2 US Embassy guards watch everything that they do. How can EU parliamentarians possibly understand what they're negotiating for Europe under these circumstances?
The world's biggest corporations don't have the same problem. They have been receiving VIP access from day one and have had abundant influence in the negotiations.
People, the likes of you and I, are excluded. Governments, to a great extent, are excluded. Those who are included are the multinational corporations.
These agreements are basically corporate ownership agreements. The funny thing about free trade agreements, as we understand them, is they often have nothing to do with trade in the sense of the mutual lowering of tariffs. What they're about is enshrining an investor rights regime in the respective countries and ensuring that corporations can run wild in the respective economies with very, very little regulation or impingement by government or authorities.
These treaties will have huge, huge implications for literally almost every critical issue that an individual citizen or community would care about: health, education, the environment, privacy, access to medicines. I mean, the list could go on.
One of the most criticised aspects of TTIP is a system called the Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. It's a secretive international tribunal that allows companies to sue states over virtually anything that they can claim affects their investment.
If a protest affects their profits, they can sue. If laws affect their profits, they can sue. If new regulations might impact where or what they want to do with their money, they can sue.
This is a new power which will be handed over to US corporations to sue the governments of Europe in a parallel judicial system which is available to them alone. So people have no access to it, domestic firms have no access to it, governments have no access to it. It's just there for foreign investors, in this case, US corporations.
Based on ISDS history, critics argue that European state sovereignty and democracy are at serious risk. Previous lawsuits include Swedish company Vattenfall suing the German state for $3.7 billion for phasing out nuclear energy. British American Tobacco sued Australia for passing a law limiting cigarette advertising. the French company Veolia sued Egypt for raising the minimum wage. TTIP advocates say that in order for the EU and US to become a single market, regulatory barriers need to be eliminated. This way, for example, a US seatbelt manufacturer already selling seatbelts domestically wouldn't need to test for safety a second time, as the EU would agree to recognise the US safety standards. They argue that this would save costs, create jobs, and lower prices for consumers. But just how safe are US standards?
So in the USA, 70% of all processed food sold in supermarkets contains genetically modified ingredients, whereas in the European Union, we've said quite clearly we don't want GM ingredients in our food chain. Similarly, in the US, 90% of all beef is produced using growth hormones, which have been found to be carcinogenic in humans. So they're banned in the European Union. And what the US government is saying is that under TTIP, under the free trade rules that they want to bring in, European consumers don't get the right to choose.
TTIP includes all the most important public sectors in Europe, including education, water, railways, postal services, and most controversially, it also includes public health services.
What is so scary about this is that corporations want to lock in their power. So they not only want increased power, but they want to make it impossible for sovereign governments to reverse the changes which are going to give them power. So, for example, with TTIP, if it passes with ISDS in it, the privatisation of the National Health Service, which is happening in the UK, can never be reversed.
What is democratic about an enormous imposition of power on countries whose citizens have no way of knowing what's going on, of debating it, or influencing their government in its decision? That's anti-democratic.
The history of these agreements shows that they're very difficult to change unless people can see what's in them. And that's why they're kept secret. Because when the contents are revealed, it generates an opposition.
WikiLeaks has had considerable success delaying the TPP and opening up the debate around it and the TISA by releasing the secret draft texts. Our publication of an earlier proposed US-EU agreement, the ACTA, killed it entirely. WikiLeaks is raising a €100,000 reward for Europe's most wanted secret, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Help the world become a more transparent place. Do your part. Go to wikileaks.org/TTIP-reward.
Many places, many countries in Latin America, where there's lots of resources, are willing to accept the TTIP proposals or the TPP proposals, which are in favor, of course, to create parallel economies that only benefits the corporations. And when Latin America is filled with poor people, systematic assassinations, corruption, and governments that are over and over again re-elected from families and elites that have not stopped for 200 years, well, it's not a convenient factor for Latin America when it comes to trade, when it comes to abuses. And now that the president of Colombia, one of the most important countries in South America and Latin America regarding resources, he was awarded the Nobel Prize just in the beginning of, because of the peace process there. It is important to acknowledge here that the peace process in Colombia, yes, it was necessary, but the peace process was between the government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC. Not with the peoples, not with the economy itself, not with the agro-industry. Because in Colombia the problem is that the President Santos, which won the Peace Award, Nobel Prize, it doesn't keep in mind, and the foreign governments like that assisted this peace process didn't talk about the agrarian reform. What is going to happen with the peasants that are dying of starvation, for example? because the corporations and the mining industry are taking over the water, like in La Guajira, for example, where thousands of kids, we're talking about more than 5,000 kids, died of starvation and thirst because the river was taken away from its course to make a dam. What's going to happen when he says only the people that has 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 or more thousands of acres of land will be the only people that are qualified, according to him, to President Santos, to produce agro-industry, not for Colombia, but for the rest of the world? What are the millions of peasants going to be? What's going to happen with the displaced people in Colombia? More than 4 million, actually. What's going to happen with the economy? What's going to happen with the lack of work for the people? What's going to happen with the corruption? Now that one of the issues that really concern the public opinion of Latin America and the world is that elections apparently and the electoral process is not absolutely clear how it works. Some of the movements in Colombia don't want to take the electronic vote in order to at least avoid the hacking or the fraud that had happened in Ecuador or that had happened in Turkey, for example, where, of course, the elections were very doubtful, and the president of Turkey was elected in very doubtful situations where, of course, has been denounced by the media, the Associated Press and others, how many voters proved that pamphlets, in order for you to put it in the box, the voting pamphlet was mistaken, was wrong, the titles say only yes. It didn't say no. It didn't say choice, just for the president, etc., etc. There's many issues that had to do with the last referendum in Turkey. Not elections, but referendum. So that's something that we have to keep in mind when it comes to electoral procedures. How come these campaigners always get the presidency when it comes to families and elites, especially in Latin American countries, from Mexico to La Patagonia, but especially in Colombia? We know about Ecuador, so we need clean processes that has to be overseen by foreign countries, which have, of course, why not the ICCT? Or, I don't know, people is not putting the trust in the United Nations anymore because they see them as a branch of the corporations and powers that be, that control the banking systems, that control the mining processes, the corporations, etc. So if President Santos says that Colombia is going to be is going to dispense all the agrarian food that the countries need, because that's what Colombia is. But as long as the owners are foreigner owners in Colombia, because that's what he's doing, he's selling the country to the corporations, as explained by Senator Jorge Robledo in the Senate. And the corruption in this country is overwhelming. It's overwhelming. And the candidates that are running for presidency in 2018 are exactly the same people that have been found to be in military process, in massacre processes, and that already have been presidents, are now senators, and many others. For example, the Ministry of Treasury. It's a guy that represents the elites. Why are you going to put somebody as the Attorney General, for example, which has been a lawyer that had represented the interest of corporations in the past? I mean, huge, big, amazing corporations that profit big from countries like Colombia in gold, in mining, in water, in economic decisions. And they put this lawyer that have always worked for the super rich in charge of such an important position in office, which is to be the Attorney General. He only gonna benefit the super rich, as he did with Café Salud, for example, when he said, no, there's no merit enough to say that 120 billion pesos, no, there's no proof enough to say that they were misallocated. The same happened with the refinery in Cartagena. The same happened with health issues and the providers of health, etc. You see countries like Colombia, and it's very worrisome what is going to happen. That's one of the other points when it comes to Latin America. If the presidents, the candidates for presidents that are running for the next presidency in one of the most important countries in the world, and as an example of the Nobel Prize winner, that, yeah, wonderful that there's no more war for now between FARC and the government, but that's not peace. That's just that's a fraction of the peace that countries like Colombia need right now. Take a look, for example, to South Sudan. Take a look, for example, to Sudan. There's some data I want to share with you guys today. According to the United Nations, there are 60 million refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Libya, for all the countries that were bombarded by the United States, and to which the United States have put, of course, a ban. And the famous ban against Muslims is especially with the countries that the United States bombarded before, some of them. Yemen, for example, Libya, Iraq, Iran, of course, Syria, etc. Yeah, 65 million refugees around the world right now. People dying from starvation in Yemen, thanks to the Saudi Arabians. Not to mention that the Saudi Arabians, at the end of the presidency of Mr. Obama, they already have invested $100 billion in weaponry, as denounced by the candidate for the Green Party in the United States for presidency in 2016. What do they want more weaponry? Maybe Donald Trump was right when he said there are going to be way more 9/11s, folks. So these are things that we have to keep in mind. Okay, 65 million refugees in the world right now. 75,000 of them are unaccompanied children. That's a very worrisome situation around the world. So when we think about these matters in the World Wealth Project, we need to think how can we provide the world with better policies when it comes to foreign policies, when it comes to free trade agreements. And that's something that it is for you and I to take action, to denounce. How do we denounce that? There's many ways. For example, I want to tell you what happened and G7 just recently. Why is that? Because one of the symptoms that our world is living nowadays is that of the exclusion of when the G7 or the powers that be have trade meetings. In this case, like the TPP or TTIP, the TPP might the United States not be there, but the TPP is running wild. Those 11 countries are still pushing for the trade agreements with other countries, which control high percentage of the GDP of the world. But now what the corporations are doing is to put a 2-mile exclusion zone wherever there's World Trade Organization when it was working, or the G7 summits. So they put a 2-mile exclusion zone, so the protesters are not going to be closing the possibility for them to meet and approve those secret agreements that have been denounced by public opinion. You remember in the Clinton presidency, in the Clinton period when he was president, there was a big opposition to the World Trade Organization and how he handled the trade. this organism handled the trade. And it was disastrous for the World Trade Organization. There was no agreement in this treaty. The population was upset and furious about the World Trade Organization and the way they do free trade agreements, which are well explained by Noam Chomsky, for example. These are not trade agreements at all. These are benefits for the corporations where they can check on their benefits and they can sue the countries for whatever they wish. If there's a protest that in a place or a city where they're going to meet, so they're going to start, they can sue the country for that. They can sue countries for the benefits that they have not yet produced, even if they break all the rules against environment, because that's one of the issues that Noam Chomsky mentioned, and that is that there is no environmental protection, or it's not even mentioned in the 280 pages of the TPP or the trade agreements. So yes, now there's a 2-mile exclusion zone, which has become normal for international meetings, and we should remember, for example, that in Qatar in 2001, the World Trade Organization recognizes the access to essential medicines, which was one of the cases that the World Trade Organization was criticized for in the 90s, especially with Clinton and Seattle, and the World Trade Organization meeting that it didn't have a good ending. So yes, in 2001, the World Trade Organization recognizes the access to essential medicines that are very expensive for poor countries, and the agreement said that the medicines should have primacy over commercial interests. The World Trade Organization also agreed in Doha, Qatar, that they will address the needs of poorer countries in Cancun, in Mexico, and Develo. In many countries, walk out of the World Trade Organization after it became clear that the real agendas to expand the World Trade Organization's model in 2003 were that to make profit. When that happened, in 2003, Lee Hyun-kai, leader of the Korean Federation of Advanced Farmers Association, sacrificed himself in protest for the policies of the World Trade Agreement, Friends of the World Wealth Project. To such extremes is what the people has to do in order to make corporations and peoples of the nations around the world understand what these so-called trade agreements really are. As the World Trade Organization floods local markets with imports, 40,000 Indian farmers committed suicide to escape their debt. Over 36 million people across the globe took part in the largest protest in history against the war in Iraq. 36 million, but the war was carried on. By 2007, little progress was made concerning the World Trade Organization promises at Doha in 2001, Qatar, including the access to essential medicines to poor countries. It never happened. Poor countries' trade concerns have not been addressed since all those meetings. Millions of United States jobs have been created offshore, and wages in the United States have declined and have tainted food imports. Food imports soar, but that had not stopped the people for trying, Friends of the World Wealth Project, to make another world possible, the world of the people. That's one of the issues that the World Wealth Project considers when the word democracy is used, misused, and abused all around the world. Because it's a lie. There's no democracy not around the world. That's a use and abuse and misused word that doesn't exist, sincerely doesn't exist. It's just the benefits of the corporations. When things goes like that, Friends of the World Wealth Project, there's not going to be any possible future for the world, for the country, for us. What's going to happen with NAFTA? What's going to happen with sources of energy that we have not mentioned in the World Wealth Project, apart from those that already exist, like oil and gas industry. The World Wealth Project is inviting the Prime Minister to acknowledge these ideas that come from the World Wealth Project. What is happening then with many sources of power that we can use to advance humanity to its next step? John Hutchison, for example, zero-point gravity, cold fusion, as explained by Eugene Malov, who was killed after he proposed new sources of energy. How many people have been their equipment seized and thrown in jail because they have proven to the world and to the United States and to the world that there's many other sources of energy that we can use. We can use, for example, the Steinmeyer's cell, which is based on high-frequency pulse circuits. And it runs on water. It's just... he can use tap water to produce the experiments through electrolysis and some alloy rods, and produces 200 more energy than the energy that it takes with high-frequency electricity. Bruce De Palma, for example, the N machine. You can see the documentary Memoirs. Okay, I don't have the documentary here, but it's on free energy. The N machine, for example. Memoirs of a Madman, that's the name of the documentary. What happened with the Texas professor at AM University that works against the paradigm for trying to disprove the laws of physics and succeeded? So we have seen that I'm talking about Dr. John Ombokris. Dr. John Ombokris from the AM University of Texas, who works as an electrochemic. He's a chemist from the university, electrochemist, who isolated an isotope, tritium, by nuclear reaction in order to change the properties of metals, literally. But no. Other people, other scientists jumped into him and said, no, this is impossible, and his work was tried to be deteriorated, and he was accused, and made his life impossible for quite a while. And they say, after a while, they say, no, we didn't find any argument, any reasons, any proof that you were trying to cause harm. On the contrary, but his inventions and his demonstrations in order to produce free energy for all were put in the bucket, in the black box, in the black bag. So when we see that the world is behaving in this way, the World Wealth Project has to announce, and people in the world, all around the world, are protesting against all these kind of issues. What I wanted to say in the World Wealth Project, and to conclude here, friends, is that we have to change our ways, and we have to support the people that are trying to change our ways. For example, Bernie Sanders in the United States, it's a case where even in Europe, people are trying to look for these kinds of governments. In England, for example, where Theresa May has the lowest seats in the parliament, she might not finish her term. What is happening with Germany? It's taking things on her own hands, especially when President Trump was so disrespectful of her and made some tweets and comments, because that's the way he talks, by tweets, through tweets. And he said that, oh, German people are bad. Nobody knows what he was talking to. Was it because of the accepting of immigrants from Arabian countries? No doubt. That's another issue that we have to speak about in the World Wealth Project. What are the goods and the bads of the massive immigration? But when you see that 60 million people are being displaced or are refugees, in the world, and more than and thousands of kids, unaccompanied kids, are on their own. And what was the reason for this to happen? The pipelines, the interests of the Americans and European corporations against the Russian, the Syrian, and the Iran interests and pipelines that get to the Mediterranean in order to supply the rest of the world from the oil and the gas. It's nothing else. When is it that civilization is going to approach and is going to convince itself that these are not the ways? When you take a look, for example, to Holland. Holland just said recently, a couple of months ago, we're going to get rid of oil and gas energy sources by 2025. The same was said by Germany. We don't want to know anything about oil and gas industry. We want to rid of it by the year 2025 or before. But in Latin America, go get whatever you can. Let's open and frack. Let's use the fracking. Let's everything that nobody else is using. Let's use it in the third world countries, which are way more richer than Switzerland, than Japan, than Finland, than Holland in resources. But they live in poverty. The majority of people unemployed. The pension plans and countries from Mexico to La Patagonia are being abused all the time by the corporate American and European corporations. Take a look to the mining titles in Colombia, for example, more than 400 projects. And the president says that, yeah, it's okay. We're going to be the farm ground for the world, but only for the corporations. That's why he's going to approve the TPP. And he won the Nobel Prize for Peace. That's unbelievable. So the issues of the World Project is for you guys to understand that that's not the way the world should work or should live. The last time we talked about God a little bit when it comes to other civilizations that apparently are advising the presidents of the United States for decades now. And if the powers that be are in alliance with these kind of powers, what's going to happen to the world? The only anthropomorphic figure we have is that of Jesus Christ. In my opinion, it is my position here. Yes, it is. And he's the first extraterrestrial, because he said, my kingdom is not from this world. Said to Pontius Pilate, when he was being judged. I mentioned about Elijah. Sometimes Spanish and English get confused in my explanations. I apologize for that. But Gaia and biocentrism and all these new religions that sells like a Herbalife that now is in big trouble because it defrauded thousands and thousands of people by millions and millions of dollars. It's the same situation. There might be some good reasons for you to believe in such new religious programs based on science, but I stick with my Lord Jesus Christ because he was explaining since before the Christian era. Talking about space, he was explaining about the earth. We're going to get into that, how God knows about science, mathematics. The Bible is not an explanation about mathematics. Yeah, Galileo Galilei said, yeah, the Bible tells us how to get to heaven, not how does the heaven works, not how the heaven goes. The Bible tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. Yeah, we know that for sure. But not in questions of abductions of extraterrestrials, etc. Is the call here from the World Project is to find out if God does exist, which is kind of a debate between science and religions. The problem with religions is that religions gave very bad examples of itself, and no religion in the world right now has moral grounds, like no government in the world right now has moral grounds to attribute themselves a higher moral ground in order, especially with the TPP, with the TTIP, and TISA, and the free trade agreements and the wars all around the world. So, Jesus, come back. It's time for you to show up and put order in this disorder, fix this world up, shows that you are. The world needs you. For us, for the country, for the world. Hope to see you next time, the next edition of the World's Well Project. Thank you.